Our top story today is the unrest in Egypt, protests continuing. As many as 150 people have been killed through these protests. Tomorrow, opponents of President Hosni Mubarak say up to 1 million demonstrators will take to the streets, even as a new cabinet puts police forces back on the streets of Cairo in order to maintain public and civil order. The effects of the tensions are being felt worldwide, both in political and economic arenas. And my next guest says that fresh thinking could have seen this crisis coming and could help calm the situation down. Well, let's find out more. We're joined by Parag Khanna. He is the director of the Global Governance Initiative at the New American Foundation. He is also the author of How to Run the World. Parag, good to have you with us on Taking Stock once again. Explain in context, if you can, because we were just talking before we started, that you have written a lot about the Egyptian history, but not just modern history. This goes back to the protectorate that the British had imposed on the Egyptians, also the monarchy that was in place until 1952. So we need to understand the context of what is going on today.
Or even going back thousands of years to a very proud pharaonic civilization that saw itself as the real cultural and political leader of the world. And historical caliphates have been based out of Cairo. And yet look how far it's fallen. So that sense of wounded pride is really essential here, as well as the anti-colonial sentiments that are layered in a country that has seen itself in a way as mediating among Arab forces, Israel, and so forth, and being the diplomatic leader of the Arab world. All of that has actually come crashing down and unraveling over the last couple of decades, and most certainly today, because Mubarak was the central figure in all of those claims. And now that is really just days away, maybe, from the end.
Now, he is considered a military hero, correct? I mean, he inherited the position of president after the death of Anwar Sadat in 1981. Mubarak considered a military leader because of the 1973 Yom Kippur War against Israel.
And yet, though, he was the leader who, at least now in recent years, has been most identified with being the Arab who's willing to step forward and cut the deal with Israel, and that earned Egypt actually sort of expulsion from the Arab League at one point. But now, again, yes, the only relevance today to his military role is the fact that the military is on his side. Because let's compare it with Tunisia, where, of course, the military decided it was going to basically bow out of it, and that really accelerated the fall of the Ben Ali regime. That's not going to happen in Egypt. The military is obviously there, and now you can see with the political appointments, because you have Omar Suleiman being appointed, you have...
Now, he is the former interior minister in charge of the secret police.
Right, exactly. So, in other words, to the people, this represents no change at all, because anyone who's been following Egypt knows that he was, of course, a leading candidate all along to be replacing Mubarak, along with, of course, Gamal Mubarak, his son. In some way, the collusion between the secret police and the successor generation was bound to be there. That's been the case in many other Arab countries as well. Just look at Syria, for example. But now this new cabinet really signals to most people this is not a new cabinet at all, because you haven't changed the centralization of power with the executive branch, with the presidency. That is the aspect of Egyptian governance and government that we, as America, have refused to touch for decades and decades. Instead, we've lavished money on that. So by Mubarak staying there and appointing basically another puppet master sort of, cabinet, not much has changed, and hence you're going to have 1 million people on the street tomorrow.
What do you think happens after the 1 million people march?
Well, first we have to have the march, and I'm assuming that they're not going to have a bloodbath. There is a Tiananmen scenario.
The military has already said that they are not going to exercise force or use violence against the protesters.
Right. So what can they nudge the government to do? It's going to have to be more than shuffling the deck in terms of the cabinet. You're going to have an announcement that the presidential powers are going to be substantially reduced, that you're going to have new elections, and the parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, that were faring well in the last 5 years of parliamentary elections, but always getting suppressed. Remember, you had the police actually firing on voters and demonstrators 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and so on. So you have to have the announcement that you're going to have a free and fair parliamentary election.
All right, so the Muslim Brotherhood becomes a possible candidate to run the presidency?
Not necessarily, because the Muslim Brotherhood has now gotten behind Mohammed al-Baradei, who is sort of a secular face, known in the West and so forth. So we still don't know. know.
All right, we're going to continue the conversation. We've got more ahead with Parag Khanna. Parag, we were just speaking about the influence of Saudi Arabia. And just back up a little bit to explain to people the various sort of power interests that are in the Middle East, because you have Egypt, 87 million people. The majority are Sunni Muslims. Sunni Muslims also in control in Saudi Arabia, but Shias in Iraq and in Iran. So you have two different groups. What does this mean for the position of Saudi Arabia now that we see these protests going on and defying the government of Mubarak?
Exactly, Pimm. There's been a rivalry, really, for a long time between Saudi Arabia and Egypt for diplomatic leadership of the Sunni Arab world. Now that's really over, because Saudi Arabia, in any case, has had all the money, a smaller population, of course, but huge oil resources, which Egypt does not have. In fact, quietly, Saudi Arabia has been a major backer, financier of Egyptian development. Tons of foreign investment from Saudi Arabia into Egypt, a lot of job creation, infrastructure, these kinds of things. In fact, this is why Saudi Arabians have really looked down on Egyptians for a very long time. Now that Egypt is in complete disarray, Saudi Arabia comes out looking very strong. You'll find, obviously, the GCC countries such as Saudi, the UAE, coming off a lot stronger, demonstrating their monarchic model as being much more stable than whatever is happening to the Egyptian neighbor. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia needs Egypt, the Sunni Arab arc or bloc that's needed to confront a strong Shia-driven Iran, which has tremendous influence around the region as far as Lebanon, and most certainly in Iraq. This now comes into question. So there's geopolitical implications to this that have yet to play out, because Saudi Arabia and Egypt certainly needed each other and do still need each other in order to confront Iran.
Now, what about some of the other countries in the region, whether they are Jordan or Yemen? Are the regimes there tuning in every night to see what they think might be the future for their countries?
We're already hearing about the protests that are going on now and are being planned as smaller demonstrations of various scale, but most certainly brewing, percolating in Yemen, in Jordan, and so forth. It's really important in observing across the region to bear in mind a couple of things. First, the monarchies versus the non-monarchies. So you can't immediately just topple a King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia or of Jordan in the way that you can take out a Ben Ali or a Mubarak. So the monarchic figures are much more strongly entrenched. That's one thing. Another is, again, the role of the military, which is why Egypt and Tunisia are two different situations, because of the closeness of the military. And then the next generation. Who is the putative next generation ruler? Is that someone who has credibility and legitimacy? With Mubarak, there has always been concerns, really, for years that even though Gamal was a person Gamal Mubarak, the son, who was out with the people, who had investment banking credentials and had instituted certain...
Viewed as a technocrat.
Exactly. Someone, and then who rose into to become the head of the National Democratic Party, had built a business coalition around him, was really starting to do things. Remember, this was, of course, a fast-growing market. Goldman Sachs saying they're part of the next 11 and so forth. And Gamal has a strong role to play in that. And so the people were warming to him, but now there's probably going to be a bit of a throw the baby out the bathwater effect. Anyone named Mubarak is not really going to be palatable right now.
So when you look at the situation in Egypt, is this something that we are making too much of the connections with other countries, and there are forces that are endemic to the Egyptian situation that we really need to focus on? Because it seems as though we talk about this 30-year rule of Mubarak, and now all of a sudden he has to make all of these changes that are going to satisfy 1 million people on the streets. Is that realistic, or is there something, an underground current happening?
He's not going to be able to do that. He's not going to be able to satisfy 1 million people on the street. He's not going to be able to satisfy the 87 million people in the country. That's part of the failure of the country, the largest, most populous Arab country, where the stress on infrastructure, natural resources, and the economy is so centered around the Nile River, which has been so overused in a way. It's polluted in so many parts of the country. The stresses that are within the society cannot be satisfied so quickly. In fact, the government has no such capacity. It has done a few things that have earned praise: reform of the stock market, some investment in the Cairo area, in the municipal area, and so on, discovery of natural gas in the Nile Delta. A few things have gone well, but not nearly enough to satisfy.
And you see a lot of that money going into, let's say, middle-class projects, but they include things like gated communities, consumer products which are out of the reach of most individuals, higher food prices, basic necessities that many people can't afford, and want to know, okay, so where where's the money going and who's benefiting from all these liberalization reforms?
Absolutely. And with no buffer, no social services to protect them against the food price spikes that have really caused a lot of protests all over the world, in fact, Latin America, Africa, and in the Middle East. This is the second or third set of major food protests that we've been having in Egypt in the last couple of years. So again, none of this is really new. The Mubarak regime has not dealt with those global issues that have affected common Egyptian people in the last couple of years, and it's not really addressing it now either.
What should the U.S. response be?
What I've been saying for years, literally, is if you encourage democratization, it means you have to make friends with all sides. You have to be friends with the Muslim Brotherhood, the secular parties, all forms of opposition, because in a democracy, you never know who's going to win next. So we need to be doing that outreach that we should have been doing for years, because now we really don't know how it's going to shake out.
I want to thank you very much. Parag Khanna, coming to us from the New American Frontier Foundation. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Also, the author of the book, How to Run the World.